You may think of Maccreanor Lavington as housing designers, and, well, not only housing designers, but we have built thousands of homes, largely in London, but mostly in cities in the last 20 years. All of them have been built on brownfield sites, and it's fair to say that brownfield is not a field. A lot of that has had an alternative use. A lot of that in cities was formerly industrial. The consequence of this is that in the last 20 years, Inner London lost 40%, Greater London lost 24%, March to 20% of the industrial floor space. As a consequence of a huge amount of industrial floor space being lost in the last 20 years, there has been a lot of pressure on the industrial land. Land values have increased, but also the square meter costs have increased for the individual businesses. So the businesses have had to adapt substantially. They have shrunk, they have fewer floor space requirements, and digitization, automation has also have impacted that quite a lot. But the ecology of particularly inner city industrial areas has dramatically changed. They don't need massive yard spaces, they don't need lots of operational space, but they do need more shared facilities, and actually they do need to be in locations that have amenities and have different qualities. The reality is that all of this has also coincided with the creation of a typology of mega sheds that hold data centers, last mile logistics, the kind of buildings that kind of dwarf the Edwardian mills or granaries of Liverpool and the likes. And altogether, that has led to quite a substantial change in the actual ecology of industrial land, where general manufacturing, distribution, all those things, they do coexist with plenty other uses, including film studios, but also including policy or not policy compliant, yoga studios, gyms, churches, maker spaces. So there's a huge, very complex, very fragile ecology. Ecology that is undergoing a huge amount of pressure because of all of the things that are happening around it and the fact that businesses are desperate for space and that space is continuously shrinking by virtue of more and more developers wanting to build on industrial land. And the question then becomes, how do you intensify all of those industrial uses without drastically changing the character of very different businesses? Let's just say that a film studio will have very different requirements to a circular economy hub or indeed a yoga studio. If we were here 5 or 10 years ago, the response would be beds on sheds. And there has been a huge plethora of planning applications for projects similar like this one that have gone nowhere. This one luckily is nearing completion, but a lot of other ones have not really gone beyond planning. The reason for this is that if any of you has ever lived right next to an MOT garage or an Amazon distribution center, it's not fun. They're not very good neighbors, and they're quite aware of that. So they will not want residential neighbors right next to them because there may be 1 or 2 complaints. So the reality is we're yet to see how successful this building is, but we know that it is not necessarily going to be BA distribution yards that originally it was intended to. It's going to be something very different. But then there's a massive question of how do you accommodate the kind of industrial uses that the entirety of every city absolutely depends on. We do want our Amazon and we don't want our Ocado being delivered on time. So a lot of the business development work has moved away from what is called vertical co-location to horizontal co-location, which effectively means stacking, which is a fantastic way of effectively multiplying the amount of floor space you have available. But it comes at an enormous financial cost, enormous embodied carbon cost, and quite a substantial operational carbon cost. It can often enough demand a massive ramp that takes HGVs up to a different level. Equally, as with this example, it can operate on the basis of goods lifts, but again, not every single business is willing to accept that. And it costs quite a bit of money. So if 5 years ago something like this was perfectly viable and developers were desperate to build more and more of those across London, they don't do it these days. They probably will do it in 5 years' time. But as is often the case, challenges of viability and austerity lead to looking at the tried and tested and changing that quite substantially. So there's a huge amount of work that can be done to the kind of standard single-story shed that you see all around Slough, Hemel Hempstead and the likes, by making that work a little bit harder, by optimizing the yards, putting mezzanines above spaces that you can put above them, trying to get rid of any space left over after planning. it just so happens that there's a huge amount of space left after planning in any industrial estate, because that land often enough is cheap enough to do it, and there's a perception in the industry that industrial shed has to be an industrial shed, and there's zero capacity for change in the formula. Well, we ourselves don't believe in that. We believe that you can make an efficient use of land within an industrial area. You can do it in a city, so you can do it in pretty much central London. You can do it in Inner Birkenhead, but equally you can apply a very similar approach and very similar ethos to, let's say, rural Sussex or the outskirts somewhere out in the Wirral. Fundamentally, it comes down to an ethos which is of not looking at an industrial estate, but seeing an industrial area as a piece of a city. And as a case study, I want to talk about Bow Goods Yard, which is a project that we have spent the last couple of years working on for Network Rail in London. It may not seem that way, but it is a critical use to London. It is one of the few remaining railheads in inner London. It brings in about a dozen trains every day that carry aggregates, carry construction materials. They take construction spoil away from inner London to areas that perhaps we shouldn't take them to, but they do. It does have a couple of concrete batching plants that at a time where the most valuable piece of concrete batching real estate in the world, largely because the City of London depends on these two concrete batching plants because they are the closest you can get to the City of London. The challenge is that Bow Goods Yard also happens to sit right in the middle of the country's largest regeneration project. We have a beautiful view of the London Stadium from one of those aggregate heaps. We can see UCL East, we can see Stratford Waterfront, and on all sides we're surrounded by either existing or future residential communities. How the hell can you be asking anybody to build 1 million square feet of industrial floor space and intensifying the heavy industrial use and bringing in more trains to this site? The approach we've taken has been around offering something to the community before talking about what happens inside it. So we've developed a vision of a charm bracelet, which is offering uses and offering the spaces for the communities. The reality of industrial areas is that there's plenty of other uses in there that nobody talks about that are very comfortable together. Destination leisure uses, something that cities very much need, but the kind of uses that are not comfortable sitting next to residential uses, but they can be very comfortable sitting next to the kind of industrial use that will benefit from 24/7 economy and from the footfall, if not directly next to it. And we've looked at plenty of public realm improvements, improving the pet cycle routes, and generally enhancing the overall edges around what we call the industrious heart, which is going to provide up to 5,000 new jobs, which is going to provide 1 million square feet of industrial and workspace unit. It's going to provide concrete batching. It's going to provide a very, very large number of kind of critical industrial uses to London that you would think nobody would want, but we'll come on to that in a minute. The way we've approached it is by looking at Bow Goods Yard as part of a city, and therefore trying to design a piece of a city. There are certain industrial uses that can very comfortably exist in a city. They actually do benefit from footfall. They do benefit from activity. So these kinds of light industrial and leisure uses, they can very comfortably sit in a kind of park frontage and define that frontage and activate it. And there's a lot of industry that somehow in the last 200, 300 years has functioned on streets along other uses, and it can continue doing that. And this is part of our industrious heart. But we do accept that there are certain kinds of uses where it may not be appropriate to have a Sunday stroll because you will be strolling underneath probably an aggregate conveyor belt and going past quite a lot of concrete batches, which is this heavy industry that has to have a place in the city. It has to have a place in the middle of it so that it is sustainable location. But it is not necessarily something that is very comfortable to live next to. But if you don't hear it, if you don't see it, and if you don't smell it, it can actually be a perfectly reasonable residential neighbor, which is what we've been working quite hard on with the various industries that will be operating in that area, boxing out and screening so that it is not something that they see and that it's not something that they can access, but they can access plenty of other places where effectively the kind of workspaces and a big last mile distribution centers, they actually form part of a street because they will have workers, they will have visitors, they will have a cargo by couriers that will have to cycle up and down that route in the massive heat, and they will benefit from trees, they will benefit from sustainable drainage, and they will benefit from clarity of the address and clarity of how to get into the buildings, even if there will be HGVs nearby, even if the yards themselves will be filled with HGVs. And there will be some other locations where light industry will very comfortably coexist with different uses, where actually a carpenter or a gin distillery or a bakery will benefit from having a proper shop front somewhere further down, and where actually having access to a really nice brewery will benefit the climbing centre nearby, although we're not recommending that anybody should drink a beer before going climbing. But ultimately, these are the kind of uses, industrial or not, that can very comfortably coexist with a metropolitan, international importance Elizabeth Olympic Park and helping frame the setting to the London Stadium. And ultimately, we see it as something that is a piece of the city. And by virtue of being a city, it's fine for it to mix all kinds of different uses, which is what cities have been doing for the last 200, 300, 500 years, with the most civic uses being right next to the most dirty uses. And it is a fundamental part of our vision for this project, which is going beyond being simply sustainable, which is effectively do less harm, because we have to think about how we design to be regenerative and fixing what the previous generations may have gone wrong. And industrial uses have this massive potential to be regenerative because, for example, if you have a railhead, you can remove 100,000 HGV movements per annum, massively cleaning up London's air, reducing road congestion. You have, and Bruce has presented also in his schemes, a lot of roofs that can have a lot of PVs that can, in case of this development, produce enough energy to provide electricity for over 1,000 homes per annum. You can keep all of the water on site so that you can actually use water captured on site for concrete batching rather than using it of the water mains, and plenty of other environmental aspects alongside social regenerative. If you think of London legacy, you think of shiny, beautiful office buildings. But there are very few jobs that are skilled, blue-collar jobs that are actually what the local communities are requiring. So actually by providing these kinds of jobs and occasionally mixing the white-collar stuff and blue-collar stuff, which in case of Network Rail has been quite a challenge, it can be social regenerative in terms of enabling a very different kind of lifestyle that supports people living locally, alongside local sports facilities, and much better, much safer pet cycle routes. So it's not just about embodied carbon, it's not just about operational carbon, it is about lifestyle carbon as much. And all of this together, place shaping, regenerative design, and working a lot with the communities has led to something that others would probably argue impossible, and initially we thought, okay, it can't be the case. This site has had a long history of planning applications withdrawn, planning applications rejected. We thought that it would be a very, very difficult fight. The first meetings may have been like this. We achieved 100% positive community feedback just before planning submission. We are 4 weeks away from hopefully a planning consent. We've not had a single negative community feedback on the website so far. And we're not talking about 2 feedback forms, we're talking about 1,000 active participants and 500 plus feedback forms received, and all of them positive because we've taken the communities together on a journey explaining the value of industrial uses, explaining why they have to be there, and explaining what else can be offered in exchange for them accepting the reality of cities needing a place to have Amazon deliveries, among many, many others. So the key takeaways, I think for me the key takeaway is industrial uses are a piece of a city. The moment you start thinking about designing sheds as effectively buildings in a city, you apply the same kind of sensible design 101 principles that you can't necessarily see here, but the kind of principles around active frontage, rational use of space, good building lines, the very, very basics. You can do the very same thing with an industrial building the same way you apply to any other building. And suddenly you can have streets as opposed to dual carriageways with roundabouts on either end. And the reality is, and we have worked with UMC ourselves on the Bow Goods Yard, the industry formula is much more flexible than some would admit it. And we've done quite a bit of soft market testing alongside Network Rail on this project, and the big players in the industry, some of them were less happy than others, but all of them generally accepted that they will take on space in this location because ultimately businesses want more than just a functional shed. What they do want is actually a proper lifestyle that they can offer to their clients and most fundamentally to their staff. They can attract staff that will be working in good locations, and equally they can be retaining that staff because they will have something else to offer, which is a good building and a good piece of a city. Thank you.